All right, I think we are live. Good morning. It is Sunday, November 12th, 2023. I'm State Representative Paul Baumbach, here with State Representative Cyndie Romer, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Professor Stuart Kaufman, both at the University of Delaware. And we're here to discuss the Middle East crisis. Cyndie, any opening comments?
Just thank you so much for having this second conversation. Your just knowledge and experience is just something we just want to keep absorbing and learning and being able to share with our constituents and people outside of Delaware as well.
Dr. Bokhari, any opening words?
I just wanted to thank you, Paul, for your dedication and commitment to continuing this conversation. It's important to continue to have these conversations, especially in an age that is so polarized, that is so emotion laden, and you know the discourse has become so combative. We need to continue talking about this in a way that basically brings forth reason, as opposed to emotions. Not that emotions are bad; it's just that they tend to cloud and tend to exacerbate the environment.
Professor Kaufman. We'll go first names after this. I'm going to be formal on the first part.
That's fine. Thanks for arranging this. I'm glad to be here, but let's just jump in and start talking through the issues.
I put in the link to the last discussion. Not that I spelled YouTube correctly, but I put in a link to our last discussion. And there we've got all the backgrounds of everyone here, but we don't want to spend time here on what we included there. So we wanted to open with the questions, Kamran and Stuart, and we'll start with Stuart and go to Kamran. What are three things that you'd like to share that led up to the Hamas attack on October 7th?
So for me, the starting point is the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and basically the siege situation that Gaza has been in. That's really the main backdrop. The Palestinian people have basically not only no state, most of them have no citizenship. They don't have much in the way of rights. The Israeli government and the Israeli settler movement is engaged in this kind of slow creeping annexation of the West Bank. And at the same time, Gaza has been running its own internal affairs under the leadership of Hamas, but under a pretty strict blockade maintained by Israel and Egypt. So that's the main piece of background that I think that Hamas and the Palestinian people in general are reacting against. The second piece of background, I guess, would be the fact that that neither Hamas nor the political right in Israel, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister, neither of those sides is remotely interested in anything like a compromise peace. The Israelis like to say that, well, Hamas is no partner for peace, and they're absolutely right. But Netanyahu has over the years done everything possible to make sure that there would be no Palestinian partner for peace, because he doesn't want that. Both sides, both sides agree actually on the principle of the phrase "from the river to the sea," and both of them feel that all of the land in question should be theirs. So what you have, to me, is a situation where both sides are determined to have everything. Both sides are determined to leave nothing for the other side. And then that leads to the third piece of background for me, which was that Israel seemed to be making progress in getting what it wants. especially the Abraham Accords, where Israel was starting to normalize relations, not just with its immediate Arab neighbors of Egypt and Jordan, but also with Morocco, United Arab Emirates, and now they're talking about Saudi Arabia. So it looked from Hamas's perspective, from the Palestinian perspective, that the Israelis were going to get what they want, which was all of the land, and leaving the Palestinians with nothing. To me, the backdrop of why Hamas did what it did was literally willing to do anything to change the course that events seem to be following.
Kamran, any leading issues that brought us to October 7th in your view?
Yes, thank you, Paul. I totally agree with Stuart. He put it very well. The three big thing. I want to add that what we've seen in the lead up to October 7, I'm going to call them drivers that led to October 7. So one is clearly the occupation, but more so the inability of all the parties to the conflict, whether it's Palestinians or Israelis and the international community, regional Arab states, the inability to make progress in trying to, I don't want to say end the occupation, because I know how difficult that is, but at least make life better for the Palestinians in the interim. So that's a lot of pent-up anger and frustration that then groups like Hamas basically feed off of, and they exploit. And they're not the only ones exploiting it. Iran has a geopolitical, incentive to exploit the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for its own foreign policy purposes in the region. So that's one, the inability to make any progress. We're 30 years out from the Oslo Accords, and we've been moving for 30 years in the opposite direction. When I say we, I mean the world at large. Number two is, and it sort of number two explains why number one has happened. Number two is the empowerment of forces that Stuart mentioned that just don't want a solution on both sides. You have the weakening of the Israeli left and the collapse of the center, and the shift of the Israeli right to the far right. So that's one dynamic. If you look at the Palestinian side, you have, in the last 15 years, a solidification of divisions on the Palestinian side. So you have the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority led by the Fatah group in control of some areas of the West Bank. And you have the Hamas government in Gaza. So you not only have an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have an intra-Palestinian civil conflict that's sort of solidified. In essence, you've had two Palestinian authorities. So I think that is so. In other words, both sides, there's just no room. The space, the political space is occupied by forces, and mind you, Hamas has been gaining strength because of the circumstances. And in many ways, Hamas feeds off of what the Israeli right does, and vice versa. They both feed off of each other. They need each other in order to further their agenda. Hamas pulled off this attack because by essentially convincing people, recruiting people all these years that, look, we're not going to, there's no peace process. And we've been right all along. And until we have the land from the river to the sea, we're not going to be at peace. We're not going to be able to survive. Likewise, you have the Israeli right saying, as long as there are Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we can never be safe, and therefore we need to take over these territories and expel the Palestinians. Then you have, the broader geostrategic problem, which Stuart talked about. You have the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords is a process of normalizing ties between Arab states and those Arab states that are not sort of bordering the Palestinian territories or Israel. They're far afield, and that has not resulted in something tangible for the Palestinians. And in other words, the narrative of Hamas and Iran that the Arab states are throwing the Palestinians under the bus is strengthened because of the normalization process. That's how even the Saudi and Israeli negotiations that were moving along until October 7th. So I think that these are three things that really shaped October 7th, in my opinion.
Sorry, there's one more I left out I want to briefly mention, which is just the fear on both sides that I think is driving so much of what's going on right now. I mean, Israel was founded in the aftermath of the Holocaust, where half of the entire Jewish people was annihilated by insane mass murderers, and the Israelis are afraid that if they let their guard down, this could happen again. And they're not wrong to think that what we saw on October 7th was ordinary Palestinian fighters saying, "I'm a hero because I killed Jews," right? And if that's the attitude these Israelis are facing, so they are really afraid of genocide for excellent reason. And for their side, the Palestinian people are afraid of a repetition of the Nakba, with the Arab word for catastrophe, when the majority of the Palestinian people ended up refugees as a result of the 1948 war. So the fear on both sides that that they're facing national annihilation is a real underlying motive on both sides, and for both sides, it's founded in something real.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's not an irrational fear. It's completely valid fear on both sides. I do have a question. We feel so, you talked about the Oslo Accords and you talked about the Abraham Accords. We feel so far ideologically away from the Oslo Accords. That seems so far from where we could even get to at this point. But when you talk about the Abraham Accords, do you feel like those agreements are going to be able to strengthen the next steps in this process? Or do you feel like it's just kind of blown up from there as well, that now these relationships aren't helping at all in this relationship? Or do you think that what we went through to get the Abraham Accord settled, that is Saudi Arabia, is the UAE, are they able to broker conversations with Israel?
I think, Cyndie, that's a great question. I think that obviously the Abraham Accords did not lead to something tangible for the Palestinians, but I think that they have created a space in which a conversation can be had, and especially now, post October 7th. Why do I say that? I think that once the dust settles from this conflict, once we're on the other side of this conflict, and a new Israeli government, comes to the fore, I think there will be a move by the Israelis to reach out to the Arab states. They value this relationship. This is something strategic, and I think that will be the opportunity. And I think the Arab states are now under far more pressure from their own, citizens and just the whole broader Arab Muslim world and global public opinion, that the time has come to no longer sort of avoid talking about the future of the Palestinians. So I think that I wouldn't be surprised if a new Israeli government and the Arab states. And this is where I think that the Saudis have a role to play, because they're by far, for all intents and purposes, the leaders of the Arab world, given their position in the region. That they will have to move this conversation along. And I think that what has happened so far with the Abraham Accords did not produce something for the Palestinians. But I think if you put the Abraham Accords alongside the tragedy of October 7th, then we do have some space for conversation. Now, will that happen? To what extent that will happen? We just don't know yet. But I do feel that if you look at all the pressure points, there is an imperative on both the Israeli side and the side of the Arab states to say, hey, let's get serious about a Palestinian state.
I think Kamran really covered it. The only thing I would add is, what experience I had when I was in South Africa, studying, how did they manage to settle the apartheid issue? And I was speaking to Rolf Mayer, who was the leading negotiator on the government side, negotiating with Nelson Mandela and the ANC. And he told me about how after the that agreement was reached, mediators from all over the world were reaching out to him and saying, how do you do it? What's the secret sauce? And he said the first thing he tells these would-be international mediators is that if you want peace, the mediators cannot want peace more than the parties to the conflict do. So, I think Kamran is right that, frankly, for decades, the Saudis and the U.S. And more or less the Egyptians and most of the international community has been in roughly the right place. Wanting to find some kind of solution. Recognizing that it's in their interest. There are a few, players like Iran, of course, that don't want that. But I think most have. I think the problem has always been, finding folks to lead on the Palestinian and Israeli sides that want to get there.
If I may just add to what Stuart said, that was a brilliant point about the mediators not wanting peace more than the actual parties to the conflict. I think that if you apply that logic to the Israeli-Palestinian arena, you obviously need an Israeli government, and this is where I'm going to, become a bit more skeptical. The Israeli public is divided. I don't know what will happen after this conflict is over and there are new elections and how the Israeli public will come out. But it's safe to say that fear that Stuart talked about is going to be writ large, that they will want a government. So there's sort of competing interests. There is a clear majority of Israelis, according to the opinion polls, want Netanyahu gone, and they they want someone else. But how do you balance the fear factor, and which says whoever they elect has to be strong on national security, with the desire to be pragmatic and say, hey, we need to make some concessions. How do you make concessions and maintain national security? That's going to be the Israeli side. Now, on the Palestinian side, you have the problem of the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority essentially in meltdown. We talked about this last time as well, that you have an 87-year-old leader who holds three key positions. The chairmanship of the PLO, the organization that signed the Oslo Accords with the State of Israel and then became the Palestinian Authority, or at least the Palestinian Authority was established. And he's the president of the Palestinian Authority and the leader of his own Fatah faction. All three institutions are in meltdown mode, or at least evolution. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of Palestinian resentment against these three edifices. And then there are internal divisions on who will succeed Mahmoud Abbas. So it's going to be very, very difficult. And then finally, and I think that we should spend more time talking about this, is the idea that what will happen to Hamas and that sector that Hamas represents. That sector is the Palestinian right, or the Palestinian Islamist right. If Hamas, I can see Hamas losing control under military pressure, control of its government in Gaza. But that is not the same as saying Hamas will go away. It will be completely obliterated, as the Israeli leadership is saying. I mean, I know it's political rhetoric, even they don't believe that. But what do you do with that? I mean, when you impose military defeat on one side, the logic is that they will recognize that they need to compromise. And then how do you absorb them into a Palestinian mainstream that then is ready for the difficult decisions of a political compromise that can bring them closer to a Palestinian state?
So Qatar, is that true that the Qatar is where Hamas is like headquartered or run out of? And where is Qatar in all of this strategically?
So Qatar is an interesting case study. I was speaking with some friends the other day, and I said I've not seen a state like Qatar. It's very unique. It is a U.S. ally, a very strong U.S. ally. It is the world's largest producer and exporter of liquefied natural gas. And it has harbored not just Hamas, but Islamists of various stripes. Mind you, Qatar is where the Taliban Politburo was. The office was established during the Obama administration. The Trump administration used that facility to open talks with the Taliban for a settlement and withdrawal of the U.S. forces. And then the Biden administration essentially gave Qatar the role, a formal role, to oversee or to manage American interests in an Afghanistan ruled by the Taliban. I have to believe that the United States is not, the United States government sees Qatar's role as useful, to say the least, in the sense that someone has the connection to the other side, someone reliable, someone that is not an Iranian, someone that is not as unilateral or disruptive as Turkey, someone that is willing to work with the U.S. And so I think Qatar is an interesting actor, and this is an interesting sort of strategy of housing all these people. But to answer your question, Cyndie, the political leadership, and I don't know how many of them actually live in Doha, but at least like 3 or 4 top political leaders of what is now known as the Hamas Politburo. They live in Qatar, their house there, their offices are there, but there is a Gaza-based Hamas leadership as well, and it seems like they're not always on the same page, and so hence sort of the situation that we're in, that Qatar can only do so much in being a third-party mediator.
So when the recent program agreed to by the IDF for these 4-hour daily humanitarian pauses, who from the Hamas side is negotiating that, is agreeing to that, or part of those decisions? I mean, I can sort of see that to get a ceasefire, you need to have 2 parties talking and agreeing and signing something. Where's the Palestinian people don't have a spokesperson. You've got Hamas, who's the last elected, that was 15 years ago, and they're hiding from the missiles and the IDF. How is that happening from Qatar and from the Hamas leaders who are there?
So that's an excellent question. So I think there are conversations that are happening through the Qataris, but I think that there are also conversations happening through the Egyptians. The Egyptians manage that day-to-day relationship with the leadership in Gaza, just because of access, just because the history of the last 15 years when we've had 4 wars and many clashes in between, all that were sort of the truces that were put in place, ceasefires, they were mediated by Egyptian intelligence. So I think that there are individuals that are in communication with, there are individuals within Hamas that have some semblance of authority in the Gaza Strip that are communicating through the Egyptians with the Israelis. And of course, the United States is also overseeing this process of ceasefires and, you know, these pauses in fighting. But I think that this is more of a analytical diagram that I'm trying to put together here. I think reality is probably far more messy. I think that not everybody is on the same page. And there are those who sort of say, okay, we'll stop the fighting so that the humanitarian aid comes in. But then there are those who continue fighting because either they didn't get the memo or there's, you know, their interests are different. There are, you know, so who's where in the Hamas space? This is sort of a really opaque reality that we know very little of, at least when it comes to what's happening within the Gaza Strip.
One of the main things we spoke about at the several weeks ago was the seemingly mammoth humanitarian crisis within Gaza. What's happened in the past 4 weeks? You know, it seemed like maybe a week or so after that, you know, like on one day, 4 trucks got in. But when you've got 2 million people there, you know, that's abysmal. What has been the magnitude most recently of the aid getting in versus how much is needed? Can you talk about the level of water, you know, coming in, electricity? You know, what is the status of the Palestinians in? Let's start with the southern part of Gaza on just being able to survive at this time.
The short answer is that, you know, as you might expect and fear, the situation has gotten worse. Since we last spoke, I think the Israelis have somewhat, and the Egyptians have somewhat opened up the processes to allow, especially, you know, food and water and medicine to start going in. But you're absolutely right, at nowhere near the scale that's really needed, you know, to get people out of their dire need. So just this morning, there was, you know, a report in the newspaper that one of the major hospitals in Gaza has ceased to function. This one's in the northern part of Gaza because they just don't have anything. They don't have electricity. They don't have enough water. They don't have enough medication, and of course there are bombs dropping all around them. So in terms of humanitarian aid, it's been grossly inadequate for a month now, and it remains grossly inadequate. But then there's the other aspect of it, which is growing evidence that Israel is really not making much of an effort to be discriminate in where it bombs. So whether or not that one particular famous rocket attack on a Gaza hospital, whether or not that was Israel or whether that was Palestinian Islamic Jihad, is a detail, right? It doesn't matter that much because the general picture is, we see examples of Israel, for example, bombing a mosque and then explaining, well, we heard there were some Hamas guys there, essentially. And that's, that is not in accordance with international humanitarian law at all. That's a war crime. So I think there's two sides to the humanitarian picture. One is inadequate supplies coming in. The other is indiscriminate Israeli attacks in many cases.
And I would add to what Stuart just said by saying that because of that indiscriminate, bombing or airstrikes and other military, operations, the ground offensive, you've had the narrative shift. So, the narrative has shifted from, look what, the horrors of what Hamas did on October 7th, to now the global public opinion. And you see this pressure building on the Biden White House. Just the other night, you had Secretary Blinken come out and say, quote, far too many Palestinians have been killed. What is that? I mean, that's just not a statement. That's basically a message. It's a message to maintain public relations, for global consumption, but also a message to the Israelis that, look, you're really pushing it here, and don't put us in a situation where we will have to come out very strongly. We don't want to go there, but you have to make sure. Now, if you flip it, it reminds me of I'm Canadian, and I remember when Canada participated in the war in Afghanistan. The big debate in Canada was that, look, we are not the United States. We don't do military operations. We're not into regime changes. What we do is we help with the humanitarian stuff. That's our tradition. Our forces are there for reconstruction and development. But as the war proceeded, the Canadian military learned very quickly that there's only so much reconstruction and development that you will do if you're being shot at. And if you're being shot at, then you shoot back. It was a learning curve for the Canadian government, for the Canadian public. And I think that same situation is happening here is, how do you say, okay, I need to dismantle the Hamas government, and you need to do it fast because the clock is ticking. At some point, the United States will say, well, enough is enough, and we can't support you moving forward. And at the same time, provide for those humanitarian corridors, the relief operations, the provision of food. How do you make sure innocent people are not being caught? And it's really messy. And I would agree with Stuart that the Israelis have not done. They could have done far more. I think that their focus is disproportionately on going after the Hamas, infrastructure, and very little attention is being paid to make sure that it doesn't end up creating a massive humanitarian crisis, which it has. And so I think that, and I say this knowing that this is very difficult, but whether it's difficult or relatively easy, there are consequences of that. And there are serious consequences. And I think the Israelis are feeling that pressure right now. And we just have to see, what that pressure produces in terms of a policy shift or not.
Yeah, I think one detail that kind of illustrates, both sides of what Kamran was saying was that, Israel has now apparently, by some reports, broken a record for the number of international aid workers that it has killed. Right. So this both exacerbates the humanitarian situation in general, and exacerbates Israel's public relations problem. Right. So Kamran pointed out the clock is ticking, but every Israeli errant bomb makes the clock tick faster. Right. It undermines any international toleration for the the legitimate aspects of what Israel wants to do.
Well, I think it's so interesting because we're watching live war, right? Because of TikTok, because of Snapchat, we are watching war live as it happens. And I think, to your point about messaging, some of the anger I'm seeing just even within TikTok is people saying, for days, people argued over whether that one hospital was bombed by the Israelis or whether it was Islamic Jihad. But then all these other hospitals are getting bombed, right? And everyday citizens who are watching this unfold are getting, to be honest, really angry about, and I know we want to get into that, but really getting angry about the semantics of the word genocide or the semantics of some of this language, because they're seeing human life being taken on air. There's a lot of journalists that people are following now that, you almost feel like this connection to. You wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, are they still alive? And they're giving their firsthand account. And so while I'm also following to see the status of hostages from Israel and seeing, where their status is every day I wake up and I'm like, okay, where is Motaz? Where is Plesia? Like, where are these people? Because you're feeling such a connection to them and what they're following on social media. And I think, to your point, that's really where I think Israel is losing people, because they're watching it unfold.
Kamran, can you speak about this article that you posted just a few days ago regarding the possible fallout, even from successful waging by the IDF of rooting out Hamas in Palestine? What we're talking about here, as far as bad outcomes of good military results. Is that fair?
That is fair, Paul. And essentially in this article, I was trying to make the argument that it's a very difficult situation where it's, I can see Hamas government being dismantled. So, you can bring down that order, the edifice, the infrastructure, and at some point, if the military operations succeed, and they do seem to be moving into that direction, albeit slowly, you will have sort of you would have won against. If you're Israel, you would have won against Hamas, and not that you've completely annihilated it, as we were talking earlier, but you would have dismantled the Hamas regime. But what is the cost of that? And how, again, that clock, will it happen fast enough? Or will, in the process, you will create enough anger. So let's say, the cost of that is, right now the death toll is, somewhere between 10 to 15,000, perhaps even more, where there's, different reports saying, and I think there was
this is Palestinian civilian deaths. Is that the number you're saying? Okay.
Yeah, Palestinian civilians being killed, and I think that there was some report that the U.S. government believes that the death toll is actually far higher than is being reported. So to what extent that's true, I don't know. But suffice to say that is already created a global, backlash. And one of the things that is Israel is risking in with this, with the way they're conducting their military operations, where they're not caring whether it's a hospital or civilians are being killed, you have a situation where you could see protests break out in neighboring Arab states, and to the point where those governments are going to be put in a very, very difficult spot. So far, you've seen Egypt organize protests so as to make sure that these things don't get out of hand. You've seen similar thing in Turkey, and you've seen somewhat the same thing in Jordan. But I think what's on the mind of the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is I have 32 million people, and this is not good. It needs to end. And how long before patience runs out? And even in a country like Saudi Arabia that does not have a tradition of protests, that people pour out onto the streets, people get angry, and things get out of hand. That would be a very, very difficult situation for Israel, because Israel's strategy, national security strategy, is based on the idea that the Arab states are not hostile with Israel. The peace treaty in 1978 with Egypt, the 1994 peace treaty with Jordan, the efforts to have an understanding with the Assad regime in Syria before the Arab Spring, and the continuing diplomacy with Turkey, and now the Abraham Accords. All of this is because Israel realizes that its national security strategy is based on the neighboring Arab states not being hostile. Maybe they won't be hostile. Maybe their hand is forced by their own people. In a worst case scenario, you could see an Arab Spring type uprising where, you know, you know, there are sustained protests, hypothetically speaking, in Egypt, which is the most important country in all of this, especially from the point of view of Gaza. And we have President Sisi face a situation similar to President Mubarak. Then what? So I think that's the idea that I'm bringing forth here, is that the Israeli military offensive that does not pay too much attention to how many civilians are being killed could result in a victory against Hamas, but it would be a strategic loss for Israel.
Stuart, any reflections on that?
Nope, I think Kamran pretty much covered it.
Stuart, if you don't mind, I want to go to the slides that you had prepared. And we Cyndie and I raised the question of the various language that has been shared out on social media and in normal media, and hope that you can walk us through this. And I'm going to say you present, in my eyes, a very academic, here's the perspective on this side, here's the perspective on that side, and just the facts, ma'am, kind of approach that I appreciate. So, and just let me know when to advance, okay?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Paul. And you're right, that's exactly what I tried to do, is be very academic about this and just kind of say, all right, this is kind of where it is. So, the definition of genocide means, is focused on this idea in the bold italics, actions with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, including killing or taking away children, or a variety of things like that. The main thing I want to say about this is just that it doesn't really specify how big the scale of the violence and atrocities has to be before it counts as genocide. And that's what leads, it opens up the argument about whether some particular set of events is genocide or not. I mean, I take personally a very sort of common sense definition where, you have to really be killing, very, very large numbers of people before it really makes sense to call it genocide. But it's possible to interpret this definition to include much more smaller scale events. So that's why there's, it's so easy for people to hurl around the charge of genocide, because the definition isn't specific enough to say, what genocide is not. So let's move on to the next slide.
And Stuart, as you mentioned, during and leading up to World War II and in World War II, half of the Jews in the world were eliminated. One can clearly say 50%, yeah, you're clearly across the line, that's genocide. But if you have something that has killed 5% or 0.5%, there is no bright line in the definition that says this is there and this is less than that. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the issue. So then, the next sort of step down is this concept of crimes against humanity, which refers to widespread or systematic attacks against civilian populations, including, you see the list: murder, enslavement, deportation or forcible transfer of population, imprisonment, torture, rape. Right. So when you're seeing large-scale atrocities of these kinds, that looks like crimes against humanity. So that's another term you can use that's doesn't have quite the same implications as genocide, but still is massive violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law. So I think as I'll get to in the later slides, I think that's it's easier to make the case that that's what's going on really on both sides in the current Hamas conflict.
And Stuart, shortly after October 7th, Israel directed residents of northern Gaza to go south and to leave Gaza City. Is given that it was a it wasn't a forced transfer, but it was a, if you don't do this, expect Israeli bombs to be showering down. Would you say that seems to follow under the third bullet there, or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that the lawyers would argue about, if it ever got to a trial, in the International Criminal Court, which it won't, because Israel is not a party to that treaty. But certainly my interpretation would be, if you say to somebody, move or the bombs will rain down on your house, that counts as forcible transfer of population. So I think that counts. But also, the indiscriminate, air attacks would also count under that, I think.
Great, thank you.
So then, so the next piece of it is, so because genocide is, in my view, not going on right now, doesn't mean it's not on the table, right? So it's important to keep in mind that, that Hamas's position, their basic purpose in life is, in fact, from the Israeli point of view, and from mine as well, genocide. So one of the founders of Hamas, this guy Abdelaziz Rantisi, said, "We will not leave one Jew in Palestine." That's, that was a pretty authoritative statement of what Hamas's purpose was. And so you've got these other quotes saying similar things. Palestine is Islamic from the river to the sea. The Jews have no right in it, except for those who lived there before World War I, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the Israeli population, as descendants of those folks. And then you have sort of the religious version of it. Saying, Allah take the Jews and their allies, take the Americans and their allies, Allah annihilate them completely, and do not leave any one of them, right? That kind of rhetoric is very common, and it's very unambiguous calls for genocide. And I think it's important that, sometimes people say, well, Arab culture, kind of has this exaggeration element to it, so you have to kind of make some allowances for that. And maybe you do, but some people, like the Hamas fighters on October 7th, take it literally, right, and just kill as many Jews as they can. And I think, so you have to, I think, that's part of the problem, is that Hamas doesn't have the ability to carry out genocide, but they do have the intention.
Stuart, I think I had heard that Hamas more recently made modifications to their organizational mission and took the genocide part out. With so much stuff you read, it may just be noise, or it could be some basis of fact. Do you know what was underlying what I had heard about?
I don't know the details. I mean, my sense of it is that it's fairly moderate. That some of the wording might change, but I don't get the sense that the intent has changed. The latest rhetoric that I've been hearing is still, we will never accept peace with Israel. And the alternative to that is what's on this slide.
Yeah, if I may jump in over here and add to what Stuart was saying. So Hamas doesn't believe in sort of like a peace agreement. They have the word hudna. Hudna means truce, ceasefire, long-term ceasefire. And if you go back in years past, you've had the Hamas leadership offer long-term hudnas or truces, 10-year truces. But what that essentially means is that the state of war has not ended. It's just that we don't want to fight right now for whatever reason that may be. But they have not given up. I mean, it's been a sort of a clever play on terminology and a clever play in terms of modifying the language of their charter, where they say that we are willing to accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza, basically the 67 borders, but they're not willing to give up the 48 borders, in other words, the part of Israel. So that is part and parcel of the ideology of Hamas and its behavior till date.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But I think it's important to understand that here, the Israeli interpretation is fair. That what Hamas is essentially saying is, we'll agree to a short-term truce for a certain period of time while we gather our strength so we can destroy you completely.
You ready for the next slide, Stuart?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is something that really rocked me. One thing we were saying before we went live was, that if your opinion hasn't changed about what's going on, then you haven't been paying attention, because the situation is changing so fast that it's really important to keep an open mind about what's going on. So one example of that is this was pointed out to me in an article in the New York Times just yesterday by a scholar of genocide whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. But I looked up his sources, and so apparently what Netanyahu said recently, a couple of weeks ago, is Israelis are committed to completely eliminating this evil from the world, meaning Hamas. You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our holy Bible. And this we do remember. Now, this is a coded message, but it is an unmistakable coded call for genocide against the Palestinian people. So here's the Bible verse that Netanyahu is referring to. This is a quotation from the prophet Samuel saying, "This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, sheep and cattle, camels and donkeys." And then Saul attacked the Amalekites and all of his people he totally destroyed with the sword. Right. So when he says remember the story of Amalek, that's what he's talking about. And while that seems opaque to somebody who isn't into their Old Testament tradition, this is something that I've known since I was 11. Anybody who went to Hebrew school knows the story of the Amalekites. So for a Jewish audience, for an Israeli audience, this call for genocide is about as subtle as the KKK burning a cross in front of a black family's home. Right? It's really that blatant. It's yes, I want to destroy them all, but I'm going to say it in this opaque way so that I can pretend to the rest of the world that I haven't really said this. So I think this is really important. This is, for me, it's a game changer because it changes my whole understanding of what was happening on the previous slide. Right? Paul, you asked the question: are we talking crimes against humanity here? When Israel is trying to push 1 million people out of their homes, so for me, this statement by Netanyahu kind of crystallized for me an understanding that it's intentional, and more particularly the specific crime against humanity that I think is going on here is ethnic cleansing. For me, what Netanyahu has said with this message is, Israel's intention in this war is not to destroy Hamas. It is to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians out of as much of Gaza as possible, ideally all of it.
And you do have, statements from Israeli leaders pointing into this direction. I mean, the far right leadership and several cabinet ministers have been saying similar language. And it was seen as, they're angry at what happened on October 7th. But if you look at who's saying it and what group that they represent, I mean, these are far right extremists who essentially are in a zero-sum game. For them, they see this situation in Gaza as a potential opportunity to reclaim that. I mean, mind you that the settler movement had to be forcibly removed by the IDF in 2005 when then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided to withdraw from Gaza unilaterally. And those elements have not given up on Gaza. And then, of course, you have the sprawling Jewish settlements in the West Bank that also see that land as religious land that belongs to Jews, and they need to be it needs to be cleansed and it needs to be made whole. So, and you see today, there's an article in the New Yorker, I think it was published today, an interview with a female leader of the Israeli settler movement who minces no words to basically say that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have to be purged of Palestinians. So you at least so even if it is coded language by the Prime Minister of Israel, it is speaking to a large segment of his support base.
Right, but the key point is that in the past, Netanyahu would have taken the position, oh, well, I'm not like those guys. I'm not like those people who are calling for these things. I'm not a religious Zionist. I'm just a pragmatic, security first guy. But now the pragmatic security first guy is saying the same stuff. So that's what makes it so dangerous. And the fact that he's the incumbent prime minister when he says it.
Next slide.
So here's more about why I think that actually what they want to do is ethnic cleansing. Right. So you have a member of parliament from Netanyahu's own party saying right now one goal Nakba. Right. So let's expel them all. That will overshadow the Nakba of 48, which of course already made the majority of Palestinians into refugees. Then you have that Israeli intelligence ministry proposing to transfer the Gaza Strip's people to Egypt, Sinai Peninsula, right? That's exactly what they want, right? They have denied that this is really government policy, but I think it's pretty clear that it is. I think this is government policy, and it would happen. It would start happening tomorrow if the Egyptian government would open up the border. So it's really just at this point it's just Egypt that is preventing most if not all, the population of the Gaza Strip, all 2 million plus people, from being driven into exile. So that's that's what it looks like to me is going on the Israeli side.
And Egypt has no reason to support that, given their concerns with Hamas and its ties to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, of the instability that it would bring to the political world in Egypt. So that's one main reason why Egypt is certainly not saying, sure, sounds like a great idea, let's do it.
Well, right. Plus, they don't want the Palestinians either. That's the dirty little secret among the Arabs is that nobody wants the Palestinians. But yes, all of those reasons. Next slide. So now we get to war crimes, right? So the basic principle here is that if you kill people, if you're going to kill somebody in a war, it's got to be justified by military necessity, which is the third tick in the under examples. And the basic principles that determine what counts as a war crime is whether you're being discriminate, whether you're shooting at military targets but not civilian targets. And when you pick a target, there's got to be proportionality in the sense that essentially you've got to be doing more allowable damage to military targets than you are doing unallowable damage to civilian targets. So the example I have used for years is, bombing an apartment building to kill one soldier is not acceptable because you're going to kill a lot of civilians and just one soldier. That is not proportionate. So the way to make a judgment about war crimes is on a specific basis, specific incidents, specific actions. So it's much more narrow and narrowly tailored than the crimes against humanity or genocide, which are about the big picture. These are about specific acts.
Stuart, I heard that the calculus here is dynamic, in that if Hamas, in this case, is at the point where they're hurling insults across the wall and they occasionally send rockets that the Iron Dome shoots down, then the value of taking out that Hamas individual is not that great, and you shouldn't be taking out many civilians with them. But if that Hamas individual is going over nightly and murdering 6 Israeli civilians and sneaking back in, then it gets to be where you can pay a higher price in civilian collateral for taking out that Hamas terrorist. Is that, you know how podcasts, there's a zillion of them, so you hear them, you don't know if there's much basis in that. But have you heard that sort of sliding scale of an acceptable trade-off?
Yeah, I think that would come under this concept of the value of the military target, right? So the Hamas mastermind who's behind the killing of of dozens or hundreds of Israelis, right? That person is a high value military target, and so the argument would be that that makes it more justifiable to accept, basically, if you blow up this guy along with his entire family, that's okay. Right? That's the kind of argument that that Israel would be making. So in any particular case, that would be the argument: is how high value military target is it? I don't know, what the kind of the legal history on this is, to the extent that there've been international tribunals on this stuff. I don't know that they've necessarily drilled down on this to the point where they can say, okay, the person who ordered that particular hit, that's a war criminal. You don't see a lot of that. There's not a lot of case law as far as I know. So it's hard to say, who has the right of it. But it's certainly the case that that's the kind of argument the Israelis are making. But it seems clear to me that when you literally do blow up an apartment building to kill one Hamas guy, that is far beyond what can be reasonably considered proportional. Let's go on to the next slide because it gets into those details. All right. So on the one hand, I think it's important that we remember that the Hamas attack, I said this the 8th and 7th, was war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? Slaughtering people in a music festival, killing 1,400 people, mostly civilians, taking more than 200 hostage. Then there's plenty of evidence of torture, rape, dismemberment. Tony Blinken has had this quotation: a father's eye gouged out in front of his kids, the mother's breast cut off, the girl's foot amputated, the boy's fingers cut off before they were executed, right? So, so it's important to keep in mind that, yes, what Hamas did was crimes against humanity. And each individual one of those incidents was a war crime. It's also, I think, worth keeping in mind that the majority of people who carried out those acts are now dead, right? Because they died in the initial Israeli recapture of their territory. But yeah, so Hamas is clearly, I think, guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so I was having a conversation with my sister literally yesterday, when I was pointing out the stuff on the about what Israel has done. She said, "Well, what about Hamas has done?" Right? And so, of course, the answer in both morality and in general and in international humanitarian laws, two wrongs don't make a right. Right? Just because Hamas committed war crimes and crimes against humanity doesn't make it okay for Israel to carry out war crimes. So let's go on to the next slide, which is the Israeli war crimes. Right. So, this is one of those things that kind of surprised me, where you have a Israeli IDF, the Israeli military, Israeli Defense Forces. You have a spokesperson saying that the emphasis of the bombing is on damage and not on accuracy. Right. So that's basically admitting, yes, we're being indiscriminate. We're not really taking care about aiming too carefully. We just want to get revenge. Right. That's what he's pretty much openly saying. Right. So when you have a situation where more than 4,000 children have been killed, so at this point you can say that Israel's response to the October 7th attacks has already killed 3 times more children on the Palestinian side than all of the Israeli losses on that day. So that's they're just sort of disproportionate in the body count. Right, but these stories about the apartment building bombed because one Hamas member was there. Another story, and this is from an Amnesty International report, so they had some people on the ground checking it out. A case of a mosque being bombed where Israel said, well, we had heard that Hamas people were there. other cases where individual homes were bombed, and Amnesty International uh, uh, investigators were not able to find any evidence of any military target nearby. Now, maybe there was one that they didn't know about, but the overall evidence is that Israel is engaged in indiscriminate bombing, which are individually war crimes and collectively crimes against humanity. So this is the other thing that really surprised me. I thought, I expected and believed and trusted that the Israelis were going to be more discriminate than that, but they're not. I was surprised. Is that the last slide? I forget.
Yeah, it was. So the War Council has not brought a significant amount of moderation to Netanyahu's predispositions. Is that fair?
I haven't seen any evidence of it. I would have hoped, but I haven't seen any evidence. I don't know. Have you, Kamran? Have you seen any change in Israeli behavior?
No, and it's an interesting thing that you bring up, Paul and Stuart. I haven't, and it's now that I think about it, the whole thing that, hey, if the opposition is part of the war cabinet, then that would sort of moderate policy making and decision making. I haven't seen it. I mean, now what's happening behind the scenes and what is the struggles going on, we don't know. But by and large, the prime minister and his top associates are prosecuting this war basically as before. I do want to bring up something that Stuart mentioned about forced displacement. So I was thinking about what two statements from top U.S. officials, one from the NSC spokesperson, Rear Admiral John Kirby, who basically said, this was early last week, that the United States and Israel are friends, but we also disagree. And we don't agree with Israel reoccupying the Gaza Strip. And then you have Secretary of State Antony Blinken come out and say that while Hamas cannot rule the Gaza Strip moving forward, we do not want Israel to be ruling the Gaza Strip, occupying it. Now, I kept thinking, why is this statement being made? And part of me said that, well, you need to make your position clear because the Israeli prime minister is hinting at it, and you need to be able to sort of say, where do you stand? But then I also started to think that you don't say something like that unless you actually fear that the Israelis are going to do this. And you need to send them a message and say, hey, we're not going to, because you do say these things behind the scenes. I'm sure the conversations are very candor. There's a lot of candor. There's a lot of frankness, and some tough conversations are taking place behind the scenes between American government officials and their Israeli counterparts. But if you have to say it publicly, it does seem like there's some daylight there. And that's not reassuring. It's actually very disconcerting.
I agree. I think that's important. I mean, what we're seeing here is, Biden has a pretty clear strategy of, opening the war with this, with this absolute solidarity with Israel, saying what Hamas did is completely unacceptable. We're with you 100%. To get in the good graces of the Israeli population. But now he's slowly, methodically distancing the United States from some of these Israeli actions. I think, making public what he's undoubtedly saying in private as well to try to moderate Israeli behavior. So I think I think American policy is changing towards, trying to do more to restrain, the Israelis. So far, I don't think it's having really any effect. But I think that pressure is going to mount.
Yeah, and you have State Department officials. There are reports of discontent within the State Department over policies. And then you had CNN reporting that cables being sent from the region, particularly there was one from Oman, that basically sent to headquarters and said, hey, if we continue with this, and if the Israelis continue to do this, we're going to lose an entire generation of Arab youth, and that would be a strategic, if you will, setback for the United States in this region. And so there is evidence of a serious disconnect between what's happening in Jerusalem and what's happening in Washington.
But as you say, even more important is the disconnect between what's happening in Jerusalem and what's happening in the Arab world. I think I just wrote on Facebook this morning that it looks to me now like Hamas is winning the public relations battle. And that was their goal. They knew that they weren't going to win militarily. Their goal was to put the Palestinian issue back on the world agenda. Their goal was to create political pressure on Israel to do something for the Palestinian cause, to undermine Israel's position in every respect, and to cynically use the deaths of their own children as a way to get global support for their cause. It's an incredibly cynical move, but and the only way it could work would be is if Israel overreacted to the initial attacks, and Netanyahu, I think, has just absolutely fallen into Hamas's trap.
Yeah, and I think not only an overreaction, but going back to it being on display for everybody. So, we were talking before we joined this call about, I have concerns about just seeing, even with, my own kids and their friends, just this overcorrection, right? So that people are finally starting to see what the Palestinian people have been going through, living under occupation for all these years, that there may be an overcorrection that Hamas is the answer. And so, Stuart, I really appreciate your slides, because I think from seeing that, we can agree that Hamas is not the answer. This is not a peace-loving group or somebody who's even willing to come to the table in search of peace, even if they're willing to accept the 67 borders, understanding that their ultimate goal is to get back to 48 and to exile Jewish population. So I think that's something really to be nervous about. And then when you talk about what's going on in East Jerusalem, knowing that Bibi Netanyahu is not up for re-election till 2026. So, what do we see happening with him? I mean, he definitely has a base. He has a base of people that are in favor of him probably annexing additional land within the West Bank. What do you see happening over the next several years from him from a political standpoint? We are hearing about protests in Israel, but he isn't up for re-election for quite a while. So, he still holds a lot of power.
Well, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that Netanyahu is not a president. He's a prime minister, which means he can lose his job tomorrow if the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, votes him out.
Okay.
So I would not worry about him lasting until 2026.
Okay.
Kamran is right. The majority of the Israeli public wants him out, and the reason they want him out is because he spent his entire career building up an image as Mr. Security.
Yeah.
Right, and the fact that he allowed this to happen proves that he is a complete and utter failure at the main thing he said that he was trying to accomplish.
So can you talk more about the parliament side of it then?
Yeah, so it's a standard parliamentary system. And in Israel, the key thing is that it's a multi-party system. So in order to form a government, in order to become prime minister, you have to create a coalition between your party and other smaller parties that together form a majority. And so what Netanyahu had done as a result of the previous election was put together an alliance between his party, Likud, and a bunch of smaller parties, some of them which represent religious Jews, some of it which reflect even more right-wing extreme groups, including the settler movement. So he had put together what's usually labeled as the most right-wing government in Israeli history, including the people on the far right fringes who had in the past always been left out. So that's his coalition. Now you have this the centrist figure Benny Gantz bringing his party into this broader coalition. But the history in Israel is after a catastrophe like this, you wait until the smoke clears, and then the prime minister who allowed this to happen is gone. Right. So that's, for example, what happened to Golda Meir. She allowed the initial defeats in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and in 1974 she was voted out, and but replaced by somebody from her own party, which was at that point Yitzhak Rabin. So what you would expect is once the immediate crisis is over, the Israeli political elite will get together and say, okay, we agree, Netanyahu is now a liability in every possible way, so we're going to replace him. And then the fight becomes, replace him with whom? And here's the problem. The problem is, as Kamran pointed out, the Israeli left has collapsed. There isn't really a peace movement in Israel. And God knows, one thing October 7th does is to stomp on its grave, right? If it was dead before, it's not coming back now. There's nobody on the Israeli left who's saying, okay, now I want peace with Palestinians, right? Nobody has that feeling. So what you're going to get, in the medium run, right? Netanyahu is likely to be gone. I mean, his political obituary has been written many times before, always wrongly. But I'm inclined to believe this time it's probably right. But he's probably going to be replaced by somebody who's kind of like what happened in the U.S. House of Representatives. You get a speaker who's MAGA, but just not over the top in the rhetoric that he uses, but really underneath just about as bad. All right. So that's my expectation about what's going to happen. Which means, of course, that the chances of diplomatic progress are pretty low because you're unlikely to get a leader who wants to go there on the Israeli side. And the other thing is Israel's mishandling. I spent the first month of this war supporting Israel and saying, yes, Hamas has got to go. But Israel's mishandling of the war seems to me now to guarantee that that's not going to happen. Right? The United States is saying, oh, they've got to go. Israel is saying, oh, they've got to go. They're not going anywhere. Hamas is still going to be there, I think, when the fighting is done. So what you'll have is what you had before, but worse, which is hardline leaderships on both sides that don't want peace, and even more entrenched than before in their determination not to move forward on peace. That's what I expect in the next year.
Yeah, I would add that Netanyahu knows if everybody's talking that this is the end of his political career, then he has a plan. And he's not going to go quietly into the night. He does not come across as a person who gives up so easily. In fact, he doubles down. So his strategy seems to be that if this war continues and I'm able to show success, then somehow maybe I can dodge the bullet and stay in power for who knows. I don't think he knows either. And then if you if you go over to the other side, Hamas's strategy is, can we hold out like Hezbollah held out in the 2006 war in Lebanon? I'm sorry, my dog is barking.
Somebody's at your door. That's okay. That's my doorbell as well. When my dog
so Hamas is thinking that public opinion has turned against Israel, global public opinion. There's a lot of pressure. There's now friction between Washington and Jerusalem. And if this continues, and Stuart is absolutely right, they're cynically looking at this and saying it's part of their strategy. that, if more people get killed, then that increases the chances of them surviving, and that Israel's inability to impose that military defeat and then force the collapse of the Hamas government. And that's their strategy. So you have a situation where on both sides you have right-wing forces, ideologically, right-wing forces that have a strategy that it seems to be working for them for in the short term. Now, a lot of things can go wrong because by no means is this war over, and then there's the logic of the ceasefire. How do you reach a ceasefire? We have these calls for a ceasefire, but realistically, if you look at it militarily, ceasefires happen in one of two ways. The Israelis realized, like they did in 2006, after 33 days, that they cannot impose a military defeat on Hezbollah, not without a cost that is so huge so as to be prohibitive. So then the Israelis say, okay, let's do a ceasefire. That works in the favor of Hamas. The other way you get a ceasefire is if the Israelis succeed in neutralizing or weakening Hamas. Their leaders are eliminated, they lose their facilities and infrastructure, to where the people who are left decide, hey, we're going to call for a ceasefire. We're going to talk to the Egyptians and the Qataris, and we're going to accept a ceasefire, and then they will have to deal with that. Those are the two scenarios in which there is a ceasefire. The first one, will involve the United States putting pressure on Israel. Too many people have died, and we're not either you stop or we're not going to be able to support you. Obviously, these conversations will happen behind the scenes. Nobody's going to come out and say it, but that's the scenario. So we're in a very, very difficult situation. In the meantime, there just doesn't seem to be a way to protect innocent Palestinian civilians who are getting killed and displaced, and that's creating more, exacerbating the conditions on the ground.
Let me point out that Israel does have one option for preventing civilian casualties that they have steadfastly refused to consider, which is to allow the refugees to come onto Israeli territory. They could open up refugee camps near the Gaza border and say, okay, start with women and children. All the women and children who are trying to get out, you're welcome, here in these refugee camps temporarily while we go after the Hamas folks. And once we're done, you can all go home, right? That would work in the sense that it would be totally credible to everybody that Israel will want those people to go home because it doesn't want them on Israeli territories in the long term. Right? And if Israel could demonstrate that they are keeping those folks safe, they could improve their human rights image substantially and save the lives of thousands of people. That opportunity was open to them from day one. And the fact that nobody is talking about that possibility, certainly not in Israel, shows that concern for civilian casualties was simply not something that was on the Israeli agenda. Certainly not if it would in any way infringe on right-wing Israelis' interpretation of what Israeli land means. Right, letting more Palestinians on into Israeli borders is just so ideologically unacceptable in the Israeli right that it literally doesn't even cross their minds. But I think the fact that it doesn't, is really the fact that they can't get past that is really telling.
Yeah, I doubt that this government of all governments is going to do that. They're just not there, and there are people within this government who are pushing the idea that, hey, maybe this is a time to swallow the Gaza Strip. So they will,
like I said, ethnic cleansing, right? That's where they are.
Why would they bring these people inside? And then there's also the idea that maybe women and children. I agree, Stuart, is doable, But then the argument is going to be made that we don't know if Hamas is going to be able to exploit that to its advantage. So how do we distinguish and whatnot? There are arguments on both sides. It's a really complicated thing. But I want to sort of switch gears here, if you allow me. If this thing continues in Gaza, we could see, and we're already seeing clashes in the West Bank, but they're limited. I could see that if things get really ugly in the Gaza Strip, you could have clashes between settlers on one side in the West Bank and Palestinian security forces, because there will be insubordination. Right now, Mahmoud Abbas and the leadership is saying, guys, stay away from this. We just need to weather this storm and get to the other side. Let's not be dragged in. Let's not be baited in, and let's hold our emotions. But it's hard. I mean, and if this thing gets ugly in the Gaza Strip, you could see a similar kind of situation, and that would be catastrophic. I mean, imagine the casualties, because we're talking about settlements that are nearby. Yes, there's security and whatnot, and the IDF is there. But if you have armed security forces, Palestinian security forces, claiming that they're protecting Palestinians from settlers, because who threw the first punch or threw the first rock or opened fire, shot the first bullet becomes immaterial, because both sides will claim it. We could really have a very, very ugly free-for-all in the West Bank, which is what is keeping King Abdullah II of Jordan up at night, because this is his nightmare scenario, that then he can't control his own crowds, because a clear majority of all Jordanians are Palestinians as well. So this fire has the potential to expand if it's not contained.
Well, don't you think? Okay, so I mean, there's already been, I think they said 200 Palestinian deaths in the West Bank since October 7th. Tons of clashes going on. Does the Palestinian Authority militarily have any power in that region anyway? I mean, or is it? I mean, are they more just managing street crime? Because it doesn't seem like they actually have any kind of ability to protect Palestinians within the West Bank in any legitimate way.
So they don't have heavy weapons. So what they do have, they're like a constabulary. Their security forces are for local law enforcement, and they're in their areas, because according to the way it worked out post Oslo Accords, was there's area A, B, and C.
Mm-hmm.
You have the areas where the Palestinians control fully. You have shared security responsibility, and then you have areas that are fully under Israeli control, and then there are the settlements. And so it's a very complicated landscape, and like I said, this thing could get out of hand. So if you look at what happened in Syria, there were protests that became violent because they were suppressed violently by the Assad regime. And you had defections from the Syrian military, and those people became part of militias. So if the Palestinian security services descends into militias, and you do have groups like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and you have other forces there that are still being controlled as of now by the PA, but what if they lose control? And what if that scenario in which it's not just about fighting settlers and IDF, but it's about jockeying for power, the various factions. And so there's just so many ways this could get really ugly really quick.
Well, because then do you almost envision that the same thing happening in Gaza could potentially just happen full blown in the West Bank? Or do you see at that point Jordan would get involved because literally being next to them, or how would that work?
So Jordan doesn't want to get involved.
Right.
This is beyond their capability. And this is why they have been so vocal. The leadership has been so vocal that, hey, this has to stop, because it could lead to that scenario that they don't want to see happen, and they lack the capability. Then what are you going to do? I mean, You can't have Israeli forces are there, but they're an occupying force. The Jordanian forces, I mean, the last thing you want is Jordanian forces fighting with Israeli forces. I mean, that would be like, warfare. So losing control, the PA doesn't want to lose control of its gunmen. And certainly the Jordanian monarchy does not want to lose control over its people. And look, militaries are a subset of the wider population. They have the same feelings and whatnot. They're disciplined because they've been trained to be disciplined. But, if a situation gets out of hand, and I'm not forecasting this, I'm just saying this is a potential risk, then that discipline breaks down. And even if it breaks down a little bit, I'm not saying the entire Jordanian armed forces are going to lose discipline, but even if a significant number of them lose discipline, then you have a very ugly situation. Mind you, in 1970, when after the Israelis won the 1967 war and the PLO was pushed out of the West Bank into Jordan, because Jordan controlled the West Bank until the 67 war, what did you end up having? You end up having the PLO fighting the Jordanian armed forces and security forces in what is known as the Black September incident. And, that was the PLO almost, toppled the monarchy, if you will. I mean, if things had gone their way and they had support from the Syrians. And so there are precedents for things getting out of hand. The Jordanians had to bring in reinforcements from Pakistan. The Pakistani military sent an entire brigade to help them. And that's an interesting story. The guy who led the contingent, the brigade, was a then Brigadier Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, who then went on to becoming the longest serving dictator of Pakistan from 77 to 88. So that's a side story right there. But the point that I'm making is there is precedent for things getting out of control.
Yeah. Honestly, it feels extremely hopeless. I mean, it does, at least within the next 12 months, it feels quite hopeless. Any positive words?
Well, there actually is. I got one positive word, which is that the position that the Palestinian Authority has been taking has so far been very constructive, including they've said, look, if Hamas is destroyed in the Gaza Strip, we, the Palestinian Authority, will be willing to move in and govern, Gaza because we're supposed to be. But they say, they're willing to bail out Israel on this to get Israel out of the job of having to be a long-term occupier, only if Israel comes back to the peace table and starts making moves towards, reviving the peace process, reviving the two-state solution and all that kind of stuff. Which again, so they're taking the right position. It's the Netanyahu government that's been resistant to accepting that.
Actually, Netanyahu.
But on Kamran's point, they could easily find themselves saying, okay, well, if you're going to say no to that, then we're going to tell our security forces to start defending our people against the settlers, which is something in principle that they should have the right to do, but they've been too scared to do it. So they could start pushing back militarily against Israel and saying, do you really want a two-front war right now? Do you really want a two-front war against us? Right? If they want to be bold, they could play that game. And then the answer would be from the Israeli side, we know it's stupid, but we're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna go. So another way it could spiral out of control. And then of course, part three is at that point, if the West Bank spirals out of control, Hezbollah may feel like they've got to jump in on the northern front as well, right? There might be so much pressure on them that they don't care about two American aircraft carrier groups. They might start escalating their involvement. So yeah, all kinds of ways where this can go even worse than it already is.
So just today, Netanyahu said something that in response to the PA offering to come in, saying that he doesn't think the PA is in a situation to come in and rule Gaza, which has sort of heightened this idea or fear that Israel is thinking of occupying the Gaza Strip itself, as opposed to bringing in the PA. So I don't know. Maybe it's posturing. I don't know what is going through his mind, but that's not a good sign.
I've assumed that when the active military activity by the IDF completes, then there will be a period of time where the IDF is occupying. Then I picture the baton passing to Palestinian Authority or Egypt or something like that, and then then the next pass to the quote more permanent approach. Who the heck knows who's involved there? But I mean, there has to be some period where the IDF is there before they withdraw, and they identify, and the party or group is identified to be occupying that otherwise unruled area of Gaza once the Hamas infrastructure has been taken out, and then the whole reconstruction process has to begin. Is that not the case?
That is, and Secretary Blinken mentioned that in his statement from the on the sidelines of the G7 meeting the other day. He said that yes, Hamas cannot rule, neither can Israel occupy, but he acknowledged what he called a transition period. Now the question is, those transition periods could easily become longer. Mm-hmm. In one of the most recent pieces I wrote, I said that Egypt would have to play a role, even if it doesn't, because this is on their border. They're the only other power out there that can bring some order. The Palestinian Authority cannot do it alone. And I think that what would compel the Israelis to keep that transition period short is the Egyptians stepping in. But the Egyptians, as we've talked about earlier, have their own fears that, hey, the last time we, controlled the Gaza Strip was before the '67 war. That was over 50 years ago. And so for them, this was always an Israeli problem since then. And now if it becomes their problem, then how do they deal with it? And there's just so many variables that they will have to factor in any decision-making process. So, but they're the only ones. I mean, there's nobody else. Like I said, the Jordanians are worried about the West Bank. They certainly can't do anything about Gaza. I doubt that the Israelis will agree for the Turks to do something or play a role beyond diplomacy. U.S. forces are not going to get involved in this. And so that leaves the Egyptians.
Cyndie, you want to close this out with some, I'll just leave it there, which direction you want to close it out on.
Yeah, I mean, I just really appreciate the conversations. And I think that, because this has taken on such a more, there's so much in the court of public opinion about it. I just think it's important that we keep talking about it and we keep, learning. And I appreciate you both so much. I know that this encompasses so much of your life, and I just appreciate the time that you've given us.
I echo my colleague. Thank you both so very, very much. And just hope that all of your friends and family stay safe. And thank you for all you do for students at the University of Delaware and for the global community.
Thank you both for having us.
Thank you.